Communist Party leader Do Umui in the 1980s is said to have remarked that capitalists are like sewer rats. Whenever one sees them popping up, one must smash them to death. But in the 1980s, and we're sort of only realizing this now because internal sources have started to come forward. It's Do Umui who really came to see the logic of market reforms and was able to partner with much more outspoken advocates of reform, essentially buying support from more skeptical factions within the party in order to get some of the key reforms of the 80s over the line.
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le bunga, bunga, Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustavia, on fait le bunga, bunga.
Hello, welcome back. This is BungaCast, the global politics podcast at the end of history. I'm Alex Hochuli in São Paulo, Brazil. I'm joined once again by Dr. Lee Jones in London. Hello, Lee. How are you?
That's Professor Lee Jones to you.
But I only recognize Twitter credentials or X credentials as it may be, and you are at Dr. Lee Jones. So, I'm sorry. Your academic credentials are...
That's a legacy.
That's a legacy. Okay. Well, so Vietnam, you may have heard, recently celebrated the 50-year anniversary of the end of the American War, or the Vietnam War, depending on where you're looking at this from. We're taking this opportunity, therefore, to delve into Vietnam's past and present. Now, I don't know too much about Vietnam, I have to admit, and I'm looking forward to learning a lot more. Lee knows a huge amount more than I do, and our guest, Sean Fear, even more so. Sean is lecturer in international history at the University of Leeds, and in the past was a visiting professor in Vietnam. Sean, hello, how are you?
Hello, nice to be here. I am a podcast listener, actually, for quite a while now. So it's nice to meet my parasocial lockdown friends through the medium of Zoom call. And now I'm joining the pod and living the millennial dream. So great to be here.
Well, I'm sorry to have destroy the mystique by, encountering my presence directly this way, having actually two-way conversation. But I'm sure, we'll get over that. So I just wanted to, before I hand over to Lee, who's going to lead this, and bring in Sean, who's going to talk a lot more, I just wanted to maybe note a couple of things to say why Vietnam is or should be of interest. I think it can be understood as one of a few really notable winners of globalization. But it did so while not adopting the liberal democracy everybody was supposed eventually to adopt after the end of the Cold War. Now, that might put you in mind of another country, perhaps quite close to Vietnam. Well, economically, Vietnam is very closely linked to China, but is in geopolitical rivalry with it. And to make this especially current, it's one of the world's most trade-dependent countries in the world, with an exports to GDP ratio of nearly 90%. A third of those exports go to the US alone, which really puts it at the center, very obviously, of the whole Trumpian tariff question. So in this episode, what we plan to do, we're going to start by delving into Vietnam's history, focusing on the post-1945 period, before then examining contemporary Vietnamese internal politics, and then political economy and geopolitics. So I'll pass over to Lee now.
Thanks, Alex. So if we think about the way that the Vietnamese Communist Party presents the history of Vietnam, it presents itself as the modern expression of a unified Vietnamese people that have, for centuries or millennia, been struggling against and repelling foreign rule. So the American War, the Vietnam War, is just the latest instantiation of that. And the early history of Vietnam is traced back to a 1,000-year struggle against Chinese imperialism. So how true is all this? And for people that don't know very much about Vietnamese history, can you give us a very, very quick potted history? I know it gets very, very complicated before the modern period, but for the uninitiated, tell us what the story is.
Sure. And I think for anyone who has been listening to the episodes that you've done lately on nationalism, Ernest Gellner and others, Vietnam is an interesting and maybe an instructive example. Anyone who goes to Vietnam will be presented with this canon of national resistance, technically 2,000 years, I think, Lee. and the Vietnamese nation itself is dated back 4,000 years. And there's a large pantheon of supposedly nationalist resistance heroes to Chinese occupation, later France, Japan, and then the United States. I think generally the further back you go in time, the more that the historical basis of a lot of this is questionable. It's really doubtful that anything like the Vietnamese nation that we know today goes back anywhere near that far. Anything from 1,000 or 2,000 years ago is myth and legend as much as real. So, for example, one of the famous resistance figures, Ba Thieu, or Lady Thieu, you might translate it. This is somebody with a street named after her in every city in Vietnam, high schools, cinemas. But the story goes that she rode into battle against Chinese forces on top of an elephant, and also that she had 3 breasts instead of 2, each about 1 meter long. So listeners can decide how much stock we should put into this.
Sounds plausible.
I was going to ask you about, can you give us some invented traditions to make reference to another classic work of nationalism, which we discussed recently on this podcast, to give people flavor?
I think an invented tradition is the idea that there's something special and intrinsic about Vietnam and national resistance, that this is part of the Vietnamese essence. And you'll often hear even sometimes Americans involved in the war, cite this as a reason for why American intervention was hubristic and doomed to fail. Everybody should know this. There's something special about the Vietnamese. It's not that these historical figures don't exist outright, and there are some that we can speak about with a good deal of certainty, but the idea that they represented something or identified with something contiguous with what is now Vietnam, I think is pretty dubious. Most people, it's hard to know what people in villages in Vietnam 600 years ago were thinking, but their identity was very likely much more local than that. The Vietnamese emperor would be a distant figure indeed. And even among literate elites, so people who might have had the chance to travel to the capital city, maybe even to China or elsewhere in Southeast Asia, allegiance is primarily to the figure of the emperor rather than a Vietnamese nation. That's a much more contemporaneous idea. And in Vietnam, it really makes a quite dramatic appearance at the start of the 20th century. So the idea of a kind of uninterrupted 4,000-year-old national tradition is really dubious.
I'm going to ask a really dumb question, and Lee has loads of much smarter questions. But is the Vietnam that we know today, and I think most people have a sense of the geography of Vietnam, if for no other reason than the cinematic treatment of the Vietnam War, was the historic Vietnam before the 20th century more or less within the same boundaries that it is today?
Only very recently, Vietnam, more or less along the lines that we know it today, was only unified in 1802. And prior to that, there are these long, sometimes centuries-long periods of warfare between different Vietnamese polities. Often, as it turns out, a northern imperial polity and a southern imperial polity divided in more or less the same place in central Vietnam, where the wartime division took place after 1954. But even then, for much of Vietnam's history, to the extent that we can trace a kind of Vietnamese identity, it's really concentrated in the north, in the Red River Delta. Beginning about 800 years ago, maybe, what we might call ethnic Vietnamese people start to advance southwards. It's a combination of warfare and settlement, and they defeat rival polities that occupied the territory that is now Vietnam. So the Champa in central Vietnam, much of the Mekong Delta is inhabited by ethnic Khmer or ethnic Cambodians. Saigon, for example, is the land that is now Saigon was a Khmer settlement and later joined by ethnic Chinese escaping from the fall of the Ming Dynasty, long before any large-scale Vietnamese settlement arrived. So it really is a much more contingent process, I suppose.
Right.
I think under the period of Chinese domination, the idea that there were sort of Vietnamese elites simply resisting and always fighting against the Chinese is, highly dubious, because the Chinese obviously intermarried, and sometimes it was a kind of local Chinese elite fending off a different Chinese elite. And, anybody visiting, particularly, I think, northern Vietnam, can be struck by the very visible presence of obviously Chinese cultural forms.
Sure. And
temples, this kind of thing.
yeah, as often as not, what has later been repackaged as nationalist resistance to Chinese domination is something much more close to imperial elites from China intervening by invitation in the struggles of imperial elites in what is now Vietnam.
Mm. And classical Chinese, I think, way until the certainly 19th century, maybe into the 20th, was the kind of elite language, right? So I think I remember that Ho Chi Minh wrote a poem which contains the entire history of Vietnam. It's all written in classical Chinese, right?
The literate language in Vietnam for a long time was classical Chinese. There's a Vietnamese script called Nôm that is a variation of this. But even setting Nôm aside, most educated people in Vietnam would read Chinese. And that is true even well into the 20th century. There are still intellectual communities who keep up with Chinese language publications and hold their debates in this language.
So the secret dirty history of Vietnamese nationalism is that it's heavily Chinese, but the nation has been forged in large part in the early days as a attempt to establish local autonomy against the Chinese Empire in part, and then subsequently against others. But we might come back to the struggle against contemporary Chinese so-called imperialism.
Yes, and what I will maybe just quickly say, this is perhaps an obvious point, but I think it's an important one in this context, which is that if enough people believe in something, it can take on a reality of its own, regardless of what the historical pedants and spoil sports have to say about it. And it certainly is the case that a lot of people in Vietnam believe very sincerely that they belong to an ancient nation with a real tradition of resistance to foreign oppression. And this is significant because of how it shapes the still very close but often very tense relationship between modern Vietnam and modern China.
No, absolutely. So let's fast forward several thousand years a bit and skip over the complicated bits. But as you mentioned, the French colonized Vietnam and wider Indochina in the 19th century. The French were displaced temporarily by the Japanese in World War II, tried to come back and recolonize, and then were defeated by the Viet Minh in 1954. And that's when the Americans stepped in to try to prop up the anti-communist state in South Vietnam before being defeated themselves. You can see why this idea of a successful nation takes hold. They do have a good record, followed, of course, by the communist victory across the entirety of Vietnam in 1975. So how is the American war thought about in Vietnam today? How does it fit with this nationalist myth making, if you like? It seems to me that, like it's quite common in Southeast Asia, elites seem to have kind of moved on from the past, particularly the American record of intervention and causes of genocide and so on, to kind of foster a more pragmatic relationship and reach across Cold War divides. But tell us more about this, and tell us whether there's any sort of divisions among different elites or between elites and masses on this question.
It's a timely question, I think, because as Alex has mentioned, we've just passed the 50th anniversary of the end of the Vietnam War, the fall of Saigon in 1975, and we've had the opportunity to see how the state wants to present itself and its historical legacy in a very recent sense. And it's interesting as well, I think, because it is actually relatively rare to see so much fixation on the war in contemporary Vietnam. One thing that many people who visit Vietnam note that the war seems oddly absent in day-to-day Vietnamese life. And I think that that's maybe to do with the fact that Vietnam is the sort of primary association. The war is the primary association with Vietnam for many people overseas. But it's just not something that many young people spend a lot of time thinking about. It's a country where by now most people were born after the war ended. And it just isn't a part of daily life, I think, in the way that many people expect. Of course, the great legacy of the war is the Vietnamese state itself, which is a product of war communism. It is, to borrow a phrase from a very good historian, arguably a state born of war, a state whose political culture was forged and defined really in the very extreme conditions that the war against France placed upon the Vietnamese communists. I think that the ceremonies that took place a few months ago were very nationalistic and unexpectedly, I think, militaristic. There were fighter jets flying all over the place, an enormous military march through the city of Saigon. And it's a reminder, I think, that for the state, although it is distant in day-to-day life, the war is still a key pillar of its popular legitimacy, alongside the very rapid growth that Vietnam has experienced through the 1990s. And I think the ceremonies, the fixation on military hardware, technological prowess, were an attempt to show off Vietnam to an international constituency of observers, to the Vietnamese population itself, that Vietnam is now a modern, rapidly developing country that is strong, that is respected on the international stage. And I have the sense that a lot of people in Vietnam responded to this in a way that was broadly sincere, not disingenuous, not because they're the crude dupes of Communist Party propaganda. I think there still is a great deal of pride in the legacy of having unambiguously fought off the United States. There was a great deal of emotion on display in the ceremonies, and I think as well a sense of gratitude that the great epic battles of the past now seem to be behind Vietnam, that Vietnam is arguably a much more stable, less turbulent place than many other countries in Southeast Asia.
I mean, it's interesting you mentioned that there's less, with the exception of these recent commemorations, that there's less of a consciousness about the war nowadays than there was. One might even say that, at least until recently in the US, there was probably more of a memorialization of the war. I don't know if it's how would you compare these, because I don't have a sense of what it was like in Vietnam, but I don't know if there's something you can bring to light about the kind of comparison and the comparative memorialization of the wars.
Yes, well, I suppose the recent ceremonies were an invitation to everyone in Vietnam, and as far as the state is concerned, people in overseas Vietnamese communities as well, to take part in the forging of this new, dynamic, forward-thinking nation. And in Vietnam itself, the legacy of the war is much less contentious, certainly than it is in the United States, certainly than it is in overseas Vietnamese communities, and we can maybe talk about that as well. I've been struck, I think, by just how long the legacy of tension and animosity to do with the Vietnam War lingers in American foreign affairs debates, in American political conversation more broadly. And it's striking, I think, just how much the Vietnam War is understood as a kind of moral referendum in the United States about the United States and its role in the world. A lot of recent coverage and specifically responses by online commenters in the United States to coverage of the Vietnam War is really quite partisan. Just to give an example, a few years ago, there was a recent a New York Times editorial series about the Vietnam War. And this ran for well over a year. They invited academics, anti-war activists, government figures, people from Vietnam, people from the United States to write short pieces about different aspects of the conflict. And one of the things I found really striking was just how intense the commenters were. Like, some of these got hundreds of very, very angry comments, arguing strongly in support of or against American intervention. So it's illustrative, I guess, about how difficult it still remains to talk about the Vietnam War in the United States without this moral character. For many on the left, I think, and indeed many liberals, New York Times commenters, Vietnam is a bit like Star Wars. It's a kind of unambiguously feel-good story, a plucky band of rebels who, through sheer determination and the inherent virtue of the cause, can topple the empire. And it's still taken on faith, I think, by many people that the Vietnamese communists were overwhelmingly popular, that they were more or less synonymous with the Vietnamese nation, that they weren't really communists in a sense, that communism was an instrumental means to the broader end of national liberation. South Vietnam, this line of reasoning goes, the American-backed regime in the South was essentially a fictitious American creation with no real historical basis, no real support base. And for that reason, the war is seen as an inevitable failure by the United States, one in a long line of hubristic adventures like Iraq or Afghanistan. For any historian, I think these are much more complicated questions. The kind of dividing lines, I think, are much more ambiguous. But in the popular memory, broadly speaking, this is how the Vietnam War is remembered. And it's telling, I think, that the kind of anti-war position in the 1960s is referred to as the orthodox position in Vietnam War historiography.
So, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, we often talk about this long 1960s on this podcast. And I remember we did an episode recently where we were talking about, I think the episode was called Boomer Death Rattle. And it was talking about maybe the death of the long 1960s. But from what you're saying, this particular way of thinking about the war is alive and well. But just briefly, what is wrong with that interpretation of the war?
It's a good question. It really does beg the question, I suppose, what I've said. I think that, first of all, the idea of inevitable teleological preordained victory by the Vietnamese communists is, in fact, a much more contingent trajectory. There are many moments where the Vietnamese communists are actually quite weak. In the mid-1950s, really, relative to the North, they're always quite weak in the South. They struggle in the early 1960s, in 1962 especially, after the 1968 Tet Offensive. But what's remarkable, I think, is that they have this Hydra-like character. No matter how much they seem weakened, they're always able to regroup, reorganize, and reinvigorate momentum into the cause. I think as well, the tendency to link South Vietnam to Iraq and Afghanistan is understandable, but in a regional context, it really is something of an outlier. The model of American-backed authoritarian military government is generally successful throughout the Cold War. You might look at South Korea, Taiwan, Thailand, the Philippines, Indonesia. And in that sense, I think the question of what it is that makes South Vietnam fail, where other American-backed military government succeeds, is more of a dilemma than can be accounted for by a kind of fatalistic view that the South Vietnamese state was always doomed to fail.
Okay, great. Let's, again, bring it forward a bit and talk a bit about the end of history and what that looks like in Vietnam. So another similarity to China here is that Vietnam really defied Fukuyama's thesis by failing to democratize, by clinging to a notionally Leninist political system, despite adopting capitalism after the Doi Moi reforms beginning in 1986. So can you tell us a bit about this process? What has it meant for Vietnam, particularly for domestic class relations and power structures?
I'm happy to. It's such a transformative moment in Vietnamese history. And I don't want to overwhelm anyone with the historical details, but a bit of context is maybe important. I think for Vietnamese officials, the 1980s and not the 1970s are the real nadir, the real low point. And so much of Vietnamese contemporary diplomacy is informed by this experience. The North Vietnamese army, following its successful takeover of the South in 1975, found itself facing a very challenging situation. And that, I think, would be true of any governing authority confronting the problems in the South. The war was devastating. About 5 times more bombs by the United States were dropped on South Vietnam than on North Vietnam. And there's a gap, really, between the rural economy and the urban economy. The urban population swelled enormously during the war by people trying to escape the violence in the countryside. So the new state confronts hundreds of thousands of opioid addicts, unemployed people, prostitutes, orphans. It's a serious challenge. And then almost immediately, geopolitical challenges start to emerge. So the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, motivated by a very racially charged anti-Vietnamese ideology, begins to cross over the border into Vietnamese territory, attacking Vietnamese villages. In some cases, up to 3,000 people are killed in a single instance. This draws Vietnam very reluctantly into a decade-long occupation of Cambodia. And in turn, China responds with an incursion into northern Vietnam in 1979. So I just don't think the economic reforms make a lot of sense without that backdrop. That said, there are what increasingly become to be regarded as failures on the part of the communist planners themselves, particularly in the post-war South. The communists are hoping that they can spur development by rejuvenating the agricultural sector, by using rice exports as a pillar to earning foreign capital. But collectivization fails very quickly, and almost immediately there's resistance to it, including on the part of Southern communists. One of the interesting features of the war is that in the South, the communists are always much weaker. They're arguably a plurality, but never an outright majority, I think, of the population of the South. And there are many other groups that they have to contend with. So they're never able to implement comprehensive collectivization the way that they were in the North. Instead, when they take over new territory from the South Vietnamese state, they tend to allocate land on an individual basis. You're a supporter of ours. Here you go. The land is yours. It's successful to the extent that the South Vietnamese state actually tried to borrow this model. But when collectivization occurs after the war, there's a backlash by people whose understanding of what communist revolution was about was premised essentially on Lockean ideals. I'm working the land. It should belong to me. And almost immediately you see farmers in the South killing livestock rather than selling them to the state at undervalued prices, sabotaging collective farming implements. The backlash begins from the ground up, I think, and it happens relatively quickly. And I've probably already gone into too much detail here, but I think it's this combination of factors that gives what we might call market Leninists within the party the opportunity and the momentum that they need to seize the upper hand starting in the mid-1980s from much more market skeptical members of the Communist Party. But even then, it's slow going. The pace of reform is gradual. By the late 1980s, Vietnam is under very serious threat of famine, and it may well have come close to instances of starvation. The really decisive moment, I think, is in 1995 when the United States finally is willing to recognize Vietnam. This paves the way for Vietnamese membership in ASEAN. The European Union recognizes Vietnam in the same year. And it's at that point when the economic reforms really begin to bear fruit, I think.
So, I mean, as I hinted at in the introduction, on this podcast, we've often been concerned with the losers of globalization, but equally important are the winners. You know, I think we've often underlined or tried to draw attention to the fact that the transition for many of the countries, particularly in Eastern Europe, has been disappointing to say the least, with a couple of exceptions. But maybe here it's worth, kind of flipping the question around or looking at precisely a country that does very well out of the post-Cold War period, and as we've mentioned already, does so within a kind of political superstructure, which is not that which was, recommended by the West, let's say. So China is the obvious kind of comparison here. Poland is a country which does become a liberal democracy and is very successful, as we discussed that recently in episode 491, if people want to check that out, because we discussed that Polish case quite specifically. With Vietnam, what I guess accounts for Vietnam's rapid growth? You took us up to kind of 1995, where things really start to take off, but there's really a period of 35 years of strong growth, and even on a per capita basis over that period. So is there a consensus as to what accounts for this?
I'm not sure there is a consensus. This is a question that has attracted a great deal of debate, not yet so much among historians, but certainly among economists, specialists of development. And there are a number of factors, and I'm not sure I'm qualified to make the case for one factor over the others, but it's a kind of healthy confluence, I suppose. I think one line of reasoning is just that Vietnam had a lot of catching up to do. It's difficult to overstate just how difficult things were economically in the 1980s. Vietnam was poorer than most of West Africa. As I mentioned earlier, it came very close to suffering famine in the late 1980s. But it has a tremendous amount of natural resources to work with. The Mekong Delta, the Red River Delta are among the world's best areas for rice production, but there's a healthy amount of natural resources as well: coal, steel, rubber, oil, coffee, in due course, shrimp as well. This is the basis for what economists call catch-up, essentially, the transition from a very unsophisticated rural economy to something developing more quickly. I think as well that stability in government is probably a factor. And I'm not saying this as any kind of moral statement, but it is the case that the Communist Party has ushered in a relatively stable, relatively predictable period in Vietnamese politics that is conducive to foreign investment. And Vietnam, to some extent, I think, has been able to take advantage of the economic dynamism in the region. So it's attracted a lot of, in the first instance, Japanese, South Korean, Taiwanese investment, but increasingly Chinese and American investment as well. And here, in a kind of unintended consequence, I suppose, the legacy of the American war has had an impact, at least to some extent. It turns out, I'm drawing on the work of some very good historians here, but it turns out that American military bases, abandoned for decades, make great export processing zones. The highways that lead up to them, the modern deep water ports that the Americans built, the air facilities, the warehousing facilities, these are a factor as well, perhaps. I think, I guess if I was to say one thing that makes Vietnam unique from other countries in Southeast Asia, and Vietnam is part of an overall growth trajectory in the region, but I think one thing that really distinguishes Vietnam are the relatively high levels of education. This, I think, is a function of Vietnamese state capacity. Say what you will about the Vietnamese communists, but they are very well organized all the way down to the village level. It's not like many other countries in Southeast Asia where there are large regions that are contested, if not beyond the hands of the central government outright. The Vietnamese government is the kind of state, even when it was a very poor state, that had a reasonably good chance of being able to implement state policies in most of the country. So schools are prioritized by the state. They're especially prioritized by Vietnamese parents. And I think anyone who has spent any time in Vietnam will notice this. Competition among middle-class parents, especially, who have the means to pursue this, to carve out any sort of advantage for their children. Extra math lessons, computer classes, English lessons especially. That's really taken off. We're maybe not quite at South Korea levels, but it's something that the state and especially Vietnamese families invest a great deal in. And I think in the 1980s, just because everyone was so poor, there is relative equality in Vietnam. Not political economy, not in terms of political power, but the gap between people in Hanoi, people with connections to the state, and people in rural Vietnam is less significant than in many other countries. And what I think this means is that if you're a talented kid in a remote part of the countryside, you're not disadvantaged in the same way that you would be in modern Vietnam. There's a state apparatus in place to recognize your talent and to create opportunities for advancement. As well, I'm running the risk of mentioning something that's very difficult to quantitate, but it has to be said. There's just an incredible entrepreneurial character in Vietnam as well. The amount of small businesses, even very, very sort of modest street side productions, the ascent from people who start very humbly and are able to develop successful firms is striking. So I don't know. It's a combination of factors. I'm not sure I'm in a position to make the case for one or another, but there are many reasons why I think the success story is so notable.
I mean, that's really interesting to hear you say that. We don't have the time here to delve into the kind of developmental question too much more, but I find it interesting because one can hear all the factors, and obviously there's a risk of just being kind of subjective and going, well, I like that factor better, and I'm gonna hang my hat on that one. But it's interesting, to hear you talk about, well, there's a lot of catch up. Well, okay, but there were other countries which also had a lot of catch up to do and didn't, or well, it has more resources. Well, of course, but then we also talk about kind of resource curse for certain countries who are blessed with resources and become more corrupt on the basis of that and fail to develop. And then there's a bunch of other ones which one can go, well, that it could be cause or could be consequence, right? Education, focus on education could be a consequence of development and more opportunities to use one's education to advance. So there's lots of these kind of things which I guess you can toss around, but the one which strikes me the most, let me just put it this way, to be to be explicit about the subjectivism here, is the question of state capacity, and which I guess is in part a product of the communist victory, the process of war, and what follows from that, and the state's reach across society. That seems to me perhaps maybe the standout element relative to kind of other comparable countries which haven't developed as quickly as Vietnam did. I don't know.
I would say that it's wrong to think about they're just kind of a particular factor, and we have to distinguish that variable from others, right? I think what the history of economic development in this region and elsewhere shows is that it's the combination of certain factors internal to a country and then the external environment. And I think everything that Sean said, you can kind of put into the two buckets. If you think about the internal characteristics, it's very much like China. The explanation that you would give for Vietnam's development is very similar to the one that you give for Chinese development. Stability, infrastructure, a capacitated state that can engage in some level of planning to provide the necessary hard and soft infrastructure for development to happen. And crucially, I think a large, poor, but fairly healthy and well-educated, and crucially, completely politically subordinated working class. Because the legacy of communist rule is all independent social organization is completely crushed or co-opted by the state. Another similarity internal to with China is decentralization and the ability of subnational governments to experiment, often with some spectacular instances of corruption and so on, but competing with each other to attract investment, to develop infrastructure. You've got the geographical aspect, the fact that you've got an extremely long coastline, and it's the coastline in China that develops first and fastest. And I think also what you pointed to earlier, Sean, the idea of this in the survival of a kind of capitalist economy under the surface of notional communist rule, and quite a short period of communist rule before these people, the ones that didn't flee overseas, kind of come back to the fore. And then the external context is globalization and offshoring. And I think importantly, Vietnam comes online, if you like, in the 90s, just as other countries in the region are reaching a level of development where they're not in that low wage category anymore. So a country like South Korea, for example, which basically uses Vietnam as a massive industrial offshoring platform, can look at Vietnam and think we've got real advantages to be gained here, rather than moving it to Thailand, for example, because the wages are a lot lower. And then you get another round of that with the China +1 diversification strategies that we get from the first Trump administration onwards. So I think that, my own take on these kinds of questions is that what allows a country to take off economically is very historically specific and contingent, right? It's not that, if you just put all the same policies in place that this country did, just copy and paste, like the Singaporeans like to say about the Singapore story. If you just do this, well, if you're in that exact historical opportunity and you adopt those kinds of policies and you have all the relative historical endowments and the geographical ones, maybe, but try and copy paste that somewhere else and it just won't work. And that's why these other countries, which have a lot of catching up to do, don't catch up. That's my take on this.
At the risk of too much digression, it's maybe also worth noting just how significant the Vietnam War was for the development of the region as a whole. It created enormous opportunities for firms in South Korea in particular to take advantage of the lucrative American contracts that became available as a result of the war. The South Vietnamese defense minister, I think, even titled his memoir, "Digging for Gold in the Jungles of Vietnam." So South Korea was able to negotiate very favorable trade or tariff exemptions to allow imports into the United States, the chemical industry, I think in particular. It developed very specialist knowledge in contracting, in providing basic services that allowed it to capitalize on the OPEC oil boom in the 1970s. It's a really unique and contingent set of circumstances. I should say, there's debate about this among South Korean development specialists as well. Some would argue that the impact of the war is overstated. But I think just using South Korea as an example, we can see the Vietnam War as having the function almost as a kind of American Marshall Plan for Southeast Asia, but one oriented much more around military aid and military spending rather than civilian targets like we saw in Europe.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's think about contemporary Vietnamese politics then at the end of history. Is there any ideological contestation left? Or is it just a question of how do we maintain rapid economic growth and how do we divide up the spoils? So in a lot of the commentary on Vietnam, Western commentary on Vietnam, Vietnamese politics is seen in the way that Chinese politics used to be seen as a factional struggle between reformers and conservatives or hardliners. But that's always struck me as reductive and often wrong, because you get people identified as reformers who turn out to be anything but, or vice versa. So what actually animates political struggles in the party state today?
I think there have been moments in Vietnamese history, recent Vietnamese history, where we can talk in very general terms about reformers. I'd say market reformers and market skeptics, but I share your skepticism for these terms, partly because, as you know, people who give the impression of being market skeptics can turn out to be market reformers very quickly. That's happened many times in Vietnamese history. So one example, this will be an obscure figure to all but real Vietnamese specialists, but the Communist Party leader Do Mui in the 1980s is said to have remarked that capitalists are like sewer rats. Whenever one sees them popping up, one must smash them to death. But in the 1980s, and we're sort of only realizing this now because internal sources have started to come forward. People are being a bit more forthcoming in interviews. It's Do Mui who really came to see the logic of market reforms and was able to partner with much more outspoken advocates of reform, essentially buying support from more skeptical factions within the party in order to get some of the key reforms of the 80s over the line. I think you tend to learn more about English language commenters on Vietnam. You tend to learn more about their prejudices and assumptions than you do about Vietnam itself when you see these types of tropes going around. I think there are real tensions within the Communist Party. It's very difficult to talk about them with any detail because it's by design an opaque state, and there's much less scrutiny of Vietnamese politics than there is in China, where the stakes are much higher. There's much greater interest for financial newspapers to try to figure out what's going on. Vietnam just doesn't get that kind of attention. But I think that personal networks can be very important. And that's maybe not ideologically satisfying, but I think it does have a real bearing on Vietnamese politics. Just sort of informal patronage networks within the party. And you'll sometimes see people who have the reputation of being reformers have very close attachments to people seen as skeptics of market reform or conservative along these lines. There's also, maybe more so within recent years than in the past, tensions within different elements of the Vietnamese state. So the military, the Ministry of Defense, the Foreign Ministry, the Internal Security Service, the Ministry of Police, as it's called. There's reason to believe that there have been clashes amidst some of these different organs of the state, and that this has had a bearing in some of the recent leadership drama that's taken place, which we can talk about as well. Historically, the Communist Party has tried to balance between Northerners and Southerners. So this is something that's maybe been called into question lately, but the tendency was for the leader, if the leader of the Communist Party was a Southerner, then the president might be a Northerner. So there's a kind of implicit attempt to navigate regional tensions, which can be very real in Vietnam to this day. I think it's often assumed that there is a kind of pro-US and pro-China dynamic taking place. And we can maybe talk about Vietnam's position in international diplomacy. But I think that, at least, is probably overblown, more the result of speculation and conjecture than real factions within the party.
So it's actually very difficult to identify clear factions. I mean, you are absolutely right. It doesn't achieve anything like the kind of scrutiny and investigation. It's very difficult to find any good literature on contemporary Vietnamese politics. But would you follow someone like Adam Fforde, who says, look, it's just about struggles over spoils? There's really nothing more to it than that.
Yeah, Adam Fforde is one of many people whose work I've drawn on in preparing for this conversation. And I think there are very good scholars. Jonathan London is someone who comes to mind writing about political economy as well. There are some great young Vietnamese scholars based out of Singapore at NUS who I think are worth following. But generally speaking, I think it is quite difficult to get a sense of what's going on. Vietnamese language press is very state dominated. You wouldn't necessarily know by walking around Hanoi, for example. It looks like there are many different newspapers, but they are by and large state controlled. They've been a bit more adventurous lately, but still very much state dominated. So to follow Vietnamese politics in Vietnamese, people often turn to blogs, forums. It's rumored that even very high-ranking party officials follow blogs that they're not legally meant to be looking at. But the difficulty here is, again, that it's just
Any
so speculative,
podcasts or
gossipy. I keep trying to find Vietnamese language podcasts, and I'm not sure there are any that have really caught on. I think they'd be
There's
very
been a
niche,
massive
if they do
crackdown on
exist.
social media in Vietnam, right? There's very little independent media.
There has been some crackdown, and I think this is more to do with fallout from leadership struggles than a really determined effort to crack down on the state. And this, maybe I'll say here, this is one area where Vietnam is very different than China. It just sort of qualitatively feels different than China. Anyone can access Twitter in Vietnam. Anyone can access Facebook. There was a moment, probably about 15 years ago, where it looked like the Vietnamese government might be trying to implement a much more sweeping crackdown like what we saw in China. But almost immediately, everybody in Vietnam figured out how to use a VPN. So British listeners, get in touch with your Vietnamese friends for advice on this if you're dealing with the UK government's new law. And I think the party sort of realized that this might be more trouble than it was worth. And it turns out they've also been working very closely with tech companies to ensure that all of the data is stored on servers in Vietnam. I suspect it's very likely that the state is using Facebook as a kind of monitoring and information gathering tool. And Facebook is incredibly popular in Vietnam. It's the one platform that everybody's grandmother is likely to use.
Hello friends, you've reached the end of a sample from an episode only available to subscribers. We put out 2 episodes a month for free. For access to the rest in its entirety, please join us at patreon.com/bungacast. For $7 a month, subscribers receive original, exclusive episodes with the entirety of the BungaCast cast. That's George Hoare, myself Alex Hochuli, and our contributing editors, Philip Cunliffe, Amber Lee Frost, Catherine Liu, Lee Jones, Alex Gurevich, and Lee Phillips. We've got extended interviews with guests, episodes on current affairs, and original episodes on theory, history, and culture, so as to understand the crises of our times. We also have the BungaCast Reading Club, where Phil, George, and myself present the key books and essays necessary for understanding the world today, how we got here, and where we might be going. Subscribers also get a digital subscription to Damage magazine, with whom we're partnered, and you can find all this info at patreon.com/bungacast. We do hope you'll join us. These are turbulent times, and ideologically confused ones as well. What we try to do is find political clarity to move beyond the decadent age of Bunga Bunga.
Dos A ou pas se taire.